Guys, good morning. Thank you for taking the time to watch this podcast. And this evening, or this morning, I should say, I'll be talking about the risks for heart disease and stroke. We'll just do a quick 15-minute chat on what are the key things you need to take away. Now, just by way of background, if you haven't heard from me yet, my name is Andy. I'm the clinical lead here at Readycare, or chief nerd, as my wife likes to say. So I am the guy behind the data, the interventions, and driving a lot of the, I suppose, research that we do, that side of things. Okay, so what is the key thing you need to know to reduce your risk for heart disease and stroke? So let's cover some of the things we already know. We know smoking is bad for your heart, definitely going to increase your risk of heart disease. That's absolutely true. We know inactivity, not exercising, is going to increase your risk without a shadow of a doubt. That's true. And we also know that junk food is bad for you. So those things, let's put those into a box. We already know those, they're well established. Stress, another risk factor that's going to drive, excuse me, cardiovascular disease as well. Okay, what are the things we think we know that the literature has showed over the last number of years not to be true? Red meat increases your risk or somehow drives heart disease. Just not true, not evident from the objective, empirical, clinical literature at least. Saturated fat, clogging up your arteries and trying to kill you. Cholesterol, just trying to kill you for the crack, even though we've eaten it for 2.4 million years. None of those things being true. So if we take what we know from the literature of the last 5 or 6 years, which is that intake of red meat, saturated fat, and cholesterol does not or is not positively correlated, or certainly in a causative way in terms of causing heart disease and stroke, what is? And we know the answer to this, so let's take a look at what the literature shows. Okay, this is just a little bit, I suppose, to put anyone at ease who's thinking, but I Googled it and it said cholesterol and saturated fat and red meat are bad for you. You are going to find that out there in the same way that you're going to find old, outdated advice about servicing your car. You're going to find old, outdated advice and opinion about everything. But bear in mind that the best class, best quality, objective, non-biased information that's best for your health is not what gets out there, unfortunately. It's whatever generates the most money or has the most money behind it, broadly speaking, will get the most exposure and momentum. So this is just a little bit in terms of what we do. We are a digital therapeutics company. We work with over 200 corporate clients, and we also have about 100,000 patients or so under our care in the NHS. So we've won International Scholar Awards for our research around heart disease. We've won the Clinical Pharmacy Congress Award for excellence in general practice in the UK, and we plan on collecting more accolades going forward. So we would consider ourselves international experts in metabolic health. So I just say that to let you know you're in good hands. Okay, so question. Where is the obesity and heart disease epidemic in remote tribes around the world? So they don't have a word for calorie. They don't control their portion sizes. They don't eat less red meat and low-fat yogurts and low-fat, whatever, bars and stuff like that. They just eat milk, honey, and tons of red meat and saturated fat and eggs. They do not have heart disease. Can someone explain to me why that is the case, if we should be eating less red meat and eggs? Now, by the way, the obesity, cancer, or heart disease statistics and findings in these remote tribes, and this is really important, are independent of exercise status. So if you have the mums or the dads or whatever way it's done in the tribe that stay behind and take care of kids and don't go out hunting, you have elderly or infirm, you have people who have head injuries and leg traumas and can't move and are incapacitated, it doesn't make a difference. They don't become obese, they don't get heart disease, they don't get cancers for the most part. So if red meat and saturated fat and cholesterol are driving heart disease, how is this happening? And just in case you're thinking, well, maybe they're just different to us, they're totally different humans and there's some sort of a genetic anomaly. There's actually numerous studies that show that when you take these populations and bring them into the US or bring them into a heavily westernized population or society, they get chronic diseases faster than the Americans in that society next to them. So the Canadian Inuit tribe, for example, were moved into the States as part of a study to see, these are kind of previously maybe non-PC term, but would have been described as kind of Eskimo. So the Canadian Inuits were moved in the study to the States, and they called off the study in less than 6 months because they were becoming pre-diabetic, fat, sick, depressed, developing anxiety disorders, autoimmune conditions, and so on. So the idea that these populations in these tribes are somehow just a genetic anomaly that are never going to get sick, and we all get sick over here in the Western world, it is not the case. The food environment is what drives most chronic disease. And we see this in the animal kingdom as well, where you feed an animal a diet that's evolutionarily appropriate, or a species appropriate diet, you could say, you do not see chronic disease. And now in many parts of the world, but only Western parts of the world, we are seeing, believe it or not, type 2 diabetes in dogs, but only in dogs who eat scraps. So we're giving them, the bit of potatoes and throw them a few chips and give them the bits of bread and stuff if they're at the table. We're starting to see type 2 diabetes. There is no such thing as type 2 diabetes, obesity, fatty liver, even kind of autoimmune conditions like hip dysplasia and stuff like that. You just don't see them in their animals in their natural habitat. And hence the title, have you ever seen a fat wolf? And you won't, because you can't become obese even if you eat as much food as you want, if it's appropriate to your biology. Your body will tell you when you're full. Now you start feeding, wolves and dogs food that's not appropriate for them, and they'll get sick and fat in the same way that we do. And I bring up this point just to illustrate, if you follow a diet that's not appropriate for your biology, you will get sick and gain weight and increase your risk for heart disease. Now, a really good comparison here as well, if the opposite is true, what happens? If you take wolves, for example, foxes, and you put them in inner city London and you give them access to junk food in bins, and they start pulling stuff out of skips, they actually get fat, and you'll see them waddling around and developing heart disease and so on. So we should eat a diet that's appropriate to our biology and our ancestral evolution. So this is really important to know when it comes to weight gain, and also when it comes to heart disease, is that a hormone called insulin is what drives weight gain through something called de novo lipogenesis, which is a fancy scientific term for new fat storage. So when you eat any food, your pancreas produces insulin, and insulin is the fat storage hormone. Now, if we look at which foods cause the most insulin production, because insulin causes fat storage, fat causes almost none. So interestingly enough, and counterintuitive relative to what you may have heard from the public health messaging of the last 30 or 40 years, fat does not make you fat, nor does it drive heart disease, funnily enough. The same can't be said about refined carbohydrates, so breakfast cereals and granola bars, and over-consuming breads and sugary cereals and all that sort of stuff. That absolutely drives fat storage and heart disease. So this is really important to know. Carbs and sugar drive insulin production, and so weight gain and heart disease, because high insulin levels drive heart disease, and there's no question about this. Really high insulin levels at their worst are type 2 diabetes. We call it type 2 diabetes. And if you just do a quick Google search for, does having type 2 diabetes or even pre-diabetes increase your risk of heart disease, it at least doubles and triples it. So they're kind of different manifestations of the same thing. Type 2 diabetes is a manifestation of very high insulin levels. So is fatty liver, so is heart disease, so is weight around the midsection, high blood pressure, and so on. So a lot of it comes back to that hormone insulin. Okay, so let's take a look at what's the key driver. So are we sure it's not saturated fat? We're pretty damn sure, because if we look at the largest ever meta-analysis on saturated fat, which is animal fats and heart health, and a meta-analysis is just a fancy way of saying an analysis of a large group of high quality studies. So all the studies that have been done on saturated fat and heart health, what did they show? If we look at not just correlation, because correlation doesn't equate to causation, and that just means, any good scientist knows that term, it just means that because two things are linked doesn't mean that one thing caused another. A good example of this is the epidemiological studies, which are just kind of like food frequency questionnaires given out to a couple of 100,000 people, would have shown a connection, and this is important, between red meat and cancer incidence, particularly colorectal cancer. So you could say, oh, people who eat more red meat are more likely, that term drives me mad, are more likely to have colorectal cancer. And you could say, well, that's case closed. If you didn't interpret the literature correctly, or if you didn't know how to, you could see a headline that says, eating more red meat increases your risk of cancer, which is technically true in terms of what you're seeing in the literature, but is wildly, wildly misleading. Because if you actually look at how the studies are conducted, they will say People who eat pizza 4 times a week, if they had pepperoni on the pizza, well, they're eating red meat. People who go to McDonald's 3 times a week, they're having a burger. Well, technically that's red meat. They're also having a milkshake and fries, and they're having the pizza itself and ice cream. They may be smoking, they may be stressed, they may not be exercising, and so on and so forth. So taking one factor and linking it to another, colorectal cancer, is ridiculous, because who's to say it's not the milkshakes and the fries and the stress and the smoking and the drugs they're taking that's not driving that cancer, or the sugar intake. So again, this is why it's so confusing, because if a study headline is pulling its headline or proposing a headline based on a narrative that they want to put forward, for example, papers will often do this. The Daily Mirror did this a couple of years ago, where they said, eating more than 3 eggs a week increases your risk of diabetes. And then literally a few months later, they showed another study. Another headline was, eating eggs can reduce your risk of diabetes. So again, it depends on what you want to put forward. And people like the scare factor of meat and so on causing cancer and saturated fat causing heart disease. When in actual fact, there's zero evidence that it does. And there's plenty of evidence that a whole food diet that is species appropriate and appropriate from an evolutionary standpoint will optimize your cardiovascular risk. And by that, I mean a lower carb or ketogenic diet, lower in carbs and sugar and processed food. And yes, higher in fat and meat, but real sources of whole food as nature, God, whoever you believe in, intended, will optimize your metabolic health and reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease. If you want to look at some of that research, we've done research ourselves. It'll be on our website shortly, where we have 172 diabetic patients who improved cholesterol levels. Many of them put their diabetes in remission, around 45%, had significant weight loss, 5 or 6 kilograms. Blood pressure went in the right direction. Inflammation markers will go down. Liver function markers go down, and so on. And also the likes of respected competitors of ours, Virta Health, who have shown over 5 years, 6 years, 7 years now, longitudinal research that shows that a ketogenic diet, high fat, high meat, but lower in carbs and sugar, is very beneficial for heart health, not deleterious, not harmful. And this is really interesting. So this is a tough one to get your head around, because we've had doctors saying to us, oh, your cholesterol is over 5, you might want to consider lowering your cholesterol. And I had a conversation with my doctor a few years ago, 2 years ago now, that blew me away, where I went in for something totally unrelated to cholesterol. And he said, let's run your bloods while you're here. So I came back in and he said, wow, your bloods are exceptional. They're really, really good. Oh, but I'm concerned about your cholesterol. And I said, why? And he said, well, your total cholesterol is, I think he said 6.2 or something like that. And I said, oh, that's okay. Why are you concerned about that? And he said, oh, high cholesterol and heart disease increases your risk of heart disease. I said, does it? How? And he said, it just, cholesterol can clog up your arteries. And I said, okay. And can you tell me the literature that shows that a high total cholesterol increases your risk of heart disease? And at that point, with respect to the guy, I just lost him completely. He didn't know what to say, what to do. And I said, look, the literature of the last 7 or 8 years the data very clearly indicate that a HDL of above 1.3 or 1.4, your good cholesterol, and triglycerides of lower than 1.7, independent of your total cholesterol number, because HDL and triglycerides form parts of the total number, are the better indicators for cardiovascular risk. And he looked at me and said, it took a second to give me this kind of tilted head, squinted eyes look, and said, what do you do for a living? So I explained what I do for a living. And he said, and I quote, I won't say who my doctor is, but I quote, look, I'll be honest, I don't really know, but our protocol is if cholesterol is over 5, you tell someone to take a statin. That's it. So at the first line of questioning, just one question, he couldn't give me any studies, any research, or explain why he was telling me to go on a medication. So here's a study that shows 75% of patients hospitalized for a heart attack, UCLA study, had normal cholesterol levels. And by normal cholesterol levels, they're referring to total cholesterol being below 5 and LDL cholesterol, so-called or previously believed to be bad cholesterol, being below 3.3. So cholesterol is not the best indicator, or at least total cholesterol, of heart disease. But there are 2 indicators, or 2 numbers in your what we call your lipid panel, your cholesterol panel, that will accurately predict your risk of heart disease. So let me show you what they are, and I'll come back to that in a second. So HDL cholesterol, people will often refer to this as good cholesterol because it's involved in removing damaged cholesterol particles and bringing them out through the liver. HDL stands for high density lipoprotein. And often people will say there's a good cholesterol and there's a bad cholesterol and there's a this cholesterol. There's actually not. It's totally inaccurate. There's only one type of cholesterol, and these are cholesterol carriers. Lipoprotein means the molecule is part fat, hence liposuction, part protein. So lipoprotein. So it carries cholesterol, but it's not a good cholesterol. It's just, it does good things, if that makes sense. So HDL, high density lipoprotein, your good cholesterol, when you look at your cholesterol numbers, I would focus in on good cholesterol. If that's above 1.3 or 1.4, particularly if it's above 1.5, and then your triglycerides, so you want HDL to be as high as possible. You want triglycerides to be as low as possible. So ideally, you would like your HDL to be above 1.3, the best is above 1.5, and you'd like your triglycerides to be below 1.7, and below 1 is phenomenal. Now, if you have a HDL above 1.3 and triglycerides below 1.7, and somebody is concerned because your total cholesterol is a bit above 5 or 6, based on what I see in the literature and what many people, including doctors and cardiologists who know their stuff about interpreting lipid profiles in the context of a healthy diet, like a low carb or ketogenic diet, I personally wouldn't be in the slightest bit concerned in terms of what I see in the literature. Now, many doctors would disagree based on their training in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that says cholesterol over 5 equals bad, take a statin to lower it. That's not my personal opinion, but there you go. So if your total cholesterol being above 5 doesn't give you a good indicator of your risk of heart disease, what does? And I'll finish up on this slide in a second. Just wanted to do a short one so that you understand the real risks of heart disease. So this is a great study that showed I think they had something like 10 or 20,000 middle-aged men, and they were enrolled in a study. Now, the criteria was you have to have had a heart attack to be enrolled in this study. So 10,000 men, 20,000, something like that, huge number anyway of middle-aged men who had a heart attack, were enrolled in a study and followed for 30 years. Now, they followed them for 30 years and they checked their bloods every year. And what they wanted to see was, can we draw a connection between their bloods, what their bloods show, and the risk of having a second heart attack? And the results were stark. So if you had high total cholesterol, defined in this particular study as, the total number, high cholesterol, if your cholesterol was 2, or if your cholesterol was 11, it was through the roof, the one that your doctor would fall off his chair and say, you need to go on a statin quickly, it made no difference to your risk of a second heart attack. So the guy whose cholesterol was 9 was not at a higher risk of having a second heart attack compared to the guy whose cholesterol was 3. None. Not at all. If you had high LDL cholesterol, which is low density lipoprotein, used to be referred to as bad cholesterol, and unfortunately still is. There is no bad cholesterol. Cholesterol is only doing its job. It's responding to an environment. And where that environment has lots of inflammation, it will get clogged up. But the cholesterol itself can't be bad. Why would we have 2.4 million years of human evolution only for our bodies to inappropriately attack themselves and go haywire? It's not how it works. High LDL cholesterol, so your LDL, what many doctors unfortunately still refer to as bad cholesterol, was not associated with an increased risk of heart disease. So if your bad cholesterol was through the roof or if it was on the floor, made no difference in terms of predicting the risk of a second heart attack. Now, if you had high blood pressure, which incidentally is caused by high insulin and high blood sugar levels, you had double the risk of having a heart attack. So blood pressure is really important. And incidentally, blood pressure is driven by your blood sugar levels for the most part, because it drives blood sugar levels being high, it drives that hormone insulin up. So you'll see we keep coming back to this hormone insulin and also inflammation. Now, if your insulin levels were high, so think type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, weight around the midsection, fatty liver, pre-diabetes, polycystic ovarian syndrome, these are many of the manifestations, but not all. Sleep apnea is also in there as well, and many other conditions of having high insulin levels. You had a 6.7-fold, 6.7x, nearly 7x increased risk of having a second heart attack. So that means if your risk of having a heart attack after your first heart attack is 10%, that's probably thereabouts, your risk if you have high insulin levels, high blood sugar levels, is now 67%. So a massive, almost 7x increased risk of having a second heart attack. So based on what we know in the literature, if you're really clued in and you know how to interpret the literature, what should you be concerned about? Should you be concerned about cholesterol, your total cholesterol being below 5? Or should you be more concerned with eating foods that keep your blood sugar levels under control? And I think we know the answer based on what the literature shows. So the key takeaway is this. It's important to look at things like smoking and stress and inactivity. They're definitely important. But if we look with a kind of an objective sort of a lens on and say, well, based on what the literature says and what we know over the last 5 or 6 years in particular, and what the research studies are indicating and the data indicate, what we should really be concerned about is keeping our insulin levels under control, not obsessing about total cholesterol. And by the way, the two things that indicate in your cholesterol profile whether you're likely to have a heart attack, your HDL being up and your triglycerides being down, sorry, other way around, HDL being down and triglycerides being up, that happens when your insulin levels are high. So it all kind of connects in. So if you want to reduce your risk of heart disease and stroke, eat foods which help you balance and lower your blood sugar levels. And those foods are lower carbohydrate, less bread, rice, pasta, potato, cereals, and will include foods like meat, eggs, cheese, full-fat dairy, strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, above-ground vegetables, and so on. So key takeaway, eat real food, be less focused on your total cholesterol number and more concerned about eating foods that lower your blood sugar levels and so lower your insulin levels. That is how to reduce your risk of heart disease as it relates to dietary choices and food choices. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me today, and we'll see you in the next one. Take care.